Wonderful, I see that it's recording. Okay, great. Well, I would like to ask also that as we go through, if you do have questions, you can go ahead and use that Q&A window. If anyone has any questions now, feel free to use that chat or Q&A window. I'm just going to wait for a moment here. Sean has put some helpful directions there in the chat window. Okay, I think we're getting situated. This presentation today, John Reagan and I will be presenting, and we'll introduce ourselves in just a moment here. This is a session that we did for CCC Online's annual conference, Connect. We presented that this fall, so I just wanted to make that clear. So in case you weren't able to make the conference, wonderful. It's good to see you here, and perhaps you were able to make that and you'd like to come back for more, or you simply have some questions you'd like to ask us along the way. And we will, at the end of the presentation, we'll certainly be eager to have your questions then. But as we go along, please do feel free to jump in and type those questions in the Q&A box. Okay, so just an overview of what we're going to discuss today. Again, my name is Liz Zavik, and I'm the Quality Assurance Coordinator here at CCC Online, and with me is John Reagan, and he is the Quality Assurance Auditor here with us. He's also one of our program chairs in the Social Sciences Department, so he's a wonderful person to have. He can a lot of times answer those questions you might have from a chair perspective as well. So together we make the QA team at CCC Online, and in this presentation we'll be briefly going over our QA program, and we'll be talking about specifically some of the categories of concern with our rubric. So this presentation does assume that you have some familiarity with the rubric. Even if you're not familiar with it, no worries, we will be talking about that rubric, and we'll be really zeroing in on a few categories that instructors and chairs frequently have concerns with, and also those categories that I think present the most challenges when you are teaching your classes, when you're engaging in discussions with students. Then we'll also talk about common challenges with participation of students in discussions, and we'll also be sharing some practical tips. And we'd like to certainly hear from you anytime along the way. Okay, just a tad bit of background here to give you a little bit of history. CCC Online has had a quality assurance program, and we've been doing these QA reviews for over 10 years now. And back in the beginning days of our QA program, CCC Online actually won a We Set WOW award. And the We Set is part of the WICHE organization, and the We Set WOW award actually indicates outstanding work for an organization. So at the time, and I believe that was back in 2004, we did get recognition for that as something that's, really an impressive and innovative item that would be a good tool to measure participation in discussions in an online class, in an online environment. So with our quality assurance program and our rubric currently, what we zero in on is the discussions, because that's where the e-classroom is. That's where the student to instructor and frankly student to student exchanges occur. And we'd just like to mention that in the near future, QA may expand to measure aspects of the courses that are already policy, like grading timeliness. And some of you may have filled out a survey that you recently got from your program chair, and that's exactly what that was trying to get. And we got overwhelmingly responses from you all, and you said that you thought that these proposed categories, and again, this isn't an immediate thing, but this is in the future, those proposed categories such as seeing response time to emails and quality of feedback, etc., you overwhelmingly said that you did think that was a good and accurate measure of your effectiveness in the classroom. So that was really great feedback, and for those of you who filled out that survey, excuse me, thank you very much, because that's been really valuable for us. Okay, and just to mention that you have resources if you'd like to review perhaps during or after this presentation. You can go and see for yourself the Quality Assurance Threaded Discussion rubric, and you would go to the Instructor Handbook and then go to Evaluation/Discussion, although I do have to add a footnote here that we are revising the website, so I'm sure that location will change, but you can certainly take that, print it out, take screenshots, and of course it won't go away. You all will have access to it when we do that new website revision. But just FYI, if you bookmark it, you might, I think you'll be able to go to the new page directly, but just an FYI. So online, you'll see all the categories and descriptions in our rubric. So what the categories are, what they're named, and what they mean, and an FAQ section. And those questions were culled from actual questions when I have been a guest host for managing discussions. And so I just tallied all the kinds of questions that I got on a regular basis. So I think those questions you'll find are pretty, you know, they're real questions and they're really pertinent, and you know, they've been truly asked multiple times. So we're focusing again today on some specific categories of that rubric. And I have a question. So the question is, repeat the path, to go to our rubric, and I'll just slow down and go over that again. If you go to our website, and that's ccconline.org, and you go to the instructor resources, you can get to the Instructor Handbook. So it's within our website, you go to the resources, you go to the handbook, and then you can look through the handbook. And when you, if you want to specifically see the pages on QA, you would go to Evaluation/Discussion. So I hope that answers your question, but if you have more, let me know. The focus today, again, that we'll be talking about is on several specific categories: presence and timeliness, interaction quality, acknowledgement, additional posts, or in parentheses, you could say additional information within the posts, and engagement and re-engagement of students.
All right. I think I'll jump in here. I'm John Reagan, and I work with Liz in the quality assurance process, and I'm also chair of cultural sciences at CCC Online, things like history, political science, economics, geography, anthropology, and women's studies. And it was very useful for me to come into the quality assurance position with that background as an instructor and a chair, and I'm still an instructor too. So all of the quality assurance performance categories that we're talking about today are important to me, not only as a chair, but as an instructor, because I always want to be sure to meet all of these expectations in my work. And when I think about the role of the quality assurance process at CCC Online, one thing that helps me keep it in perspective is to remember the unique nature of CCC Online and the fact that we are a service organization for the member colleges. As you know, no one gets a degree from CCC Online. The students are getting their degrees from their home colleges, you know, whether it's Arapahoe Community College or Red Rocks or any of the member colleges. But sometimes those students have a need for an online course and they can't meet that need at their home college. Maybe they registered too late, or the course is full, and so they need a course. They can take it online through CCC Online, but their main program is at their home college. And since those home colleges are transcripting these CCC Online courses on their transcripts for their students, they understandably have a concern about the quality of instruction at CCC Online. And one of the most important aspects of the quality of instruction in an online course is instructor performance in discussions. And so knowing that unique role of CCC Online and how we are kind of under the scrutiny of the member colleges, you know, they want to feel assured that when one of their students takes a course at CCC Online, that it is a valid and useful experience, that you know, 3 credits are warranted for the work that the student is doing in that course. And so the QA process just helps CCC Online get a good sense of instructor performance in the discussions. I always think for my own courses, what if my course was used as a sample for all of the member colleges to look at? You know, would I be comfortable with them seeing my level of involvement in the discussions, whether it's really active or not? Because really, everything that we're talking about today really boils down to the simple fact that as national surveys of online college students indicate, one of the things that online students want the most is extensive engagement from their instructor. And obviously, the prime place to do that is in the discussions. Of course, timely grading and good feedback in the grading, those are important elements of instructor engagement too. But as of right now, the only formal performance standards that CCC Online has developed thus far are for an instructor's discussion work. And on this slide that we're looking at now, we see the first couple of QA performance categories that we're going to talk about today: presence and timeliness. For presence, the QA standard is asking if instructors regularly post 4 to 5 different days each week. That would be for a best rating, or at least 3 days per week, which would be a good rating. And in the category of timeliness, the standard is looking at whether the instructor responds to student posts within 48 hours. That would be a best rating. Or is the instructor at least usually responding to student posts within 48 hours? That would be a good rating, a G. And some of the ways to ensure good performance in these particular categories, one would be to make sure you post something at least 3 separate days during a week. And I'll give just an extreme example here in order to make a point. Let's say I have a discussion that starts on Monday. I could go in on Monday and make a post that says something like, this will be a good discussion, this is a great topic, and I look forward to your input. And then on Tuesday, let's say no students have even posted yet. I could go back in and make a post that says something like, a new book has just come out on Thomas Jefferson's relationship with his slaves, and I would recommend it to all of you. I'm just using my own history course as an example there. Wednesday, I could go back into the discussion, and once again, even if no students have posted yet, I could make a post saying something like, it's awfully quiet in here, looking forward to your first post, everyone. Now I have met the good category for presence. I have posted on 3 different days per week. Now that, of course, is not all I'm going to do in that discussion. As student posts start being made, I'll be continuing my participation, which will help me meet the other performance categories that we're going to talk about today. And one of those is timeliness. Those student posts which you think do need to receive a response, CCC Online asks that those responses be made within 48 hours of the student's post, so that it's still fresh, the student is feeling like there is follow-up to what they said. Maybe they said something wrong and you need to correct it. Maybe they made an interesting point you want to follow up on. But for those student posts that you feel need a response, be sure to make that response within 48 hours. It's not necessary to respond to every student individually in each discussion. The only discussion for which you are asked to respond to every student individually is the introduction discussion, when we do have to make sure that we respond to every student's introductory post. But after that, you're not required to respond individually to every single student post in every discussion.
We have a question, John, and thank you for that. We have a question here in the Q&A section, which I think you have just addressed. But the question is from Ken: in my math class, it is required that students post an initial entry and reply to other students' posts. I want to reply, but I do not want to rob students from opportunities to reply themselves. And where do I draw the line? And I would agree with what John said with that. You do not need to respond to every single student, and I think there certainly is such a thing as maybe, as you said, dominating or overwhelming students. But what you can do is you allow those students to talk to each other, but also when a post, let's say, is a direct question to you, or a direct question or something that you definitely want to address, when it is appropriate for you to respond, that then you're responding within that 48-hour window.
Very good.
And I'm going to go ahead and if you have follow-up questions, Ken, please don't hesitate to ask. But I'm going to go ahead to this next slide.
All right. One of the challenges that we observe in discussions is what if students do not make posts until the last minute? That can happen in a course, and you can address this with some of your own posts in the discussion, encouraging the pacing of student posts. You know, that please be sure to make your initial post by X date. I'm looking forward to your follow-up on the points that have been raised. You also can make posts that, as we'll talk about here in some of our next categories, that encourage the students, posts that add new information, posts that remind students of the deadline in the course.
We have another related question here,
Yes.
actually in the chat from Janice. And John, would you like to address that? Or
let me take a look there.
Oh, sure. I can go ahead and, just for the benefit of everyone in the room, just go ahead and read it. It's from Janice. So she says, we need to post only once, 4 to 5 days per week then, with the exception of the introduction thread and student postings that require specific responses from us.
Okay, thanks for asking, Janice. The answer to that would be yes, for the category of presence. Remember, there are several important performance categories in the QA rubric. For presence, you want to respond, make a post 4 to 5 different days of the week, and you will be doing a good job in the category of presence. To meet the performance expectations in these other categories that we'll be talking about today, like adding to the discussion or acknowledging students, re-engaging students, you'll want to make additional posts of a specific nature to meet those performance expectations. So always remember that there are several important performance expectations, and you could do a good job in one while maybe not quite meeting the expectation in another. And we want to help all of you meet them in all the categories.
I just wanted to mention also, Ken has a comment here. I usually post assignment reminders in the news area the D2L course page, and it seems to work well. And we do actually on the QA form now, we just have a little box we check to see if people are using that news area. That may be expanded in the future, but certainly that's something we see a lot, and that's an effective way to funnel students back into the discussion if they seem to have forgotten. So I just wanted to thank you for that comment.
And a question about that has come up in some of these presentations in the past, so I just wanted to mention, Ken, and everyone, that it's certainly okay to post something in both the discussions and over in the news section. Nothing wrong with that. So during the course of a discussion, you could make a post which mentions, here are assignment deadlines for this unit, everyone. You could make the same post over in the news section, and that's fine. All right. Interaction quality, another important performance category in the QA rubric. And my screen is stuck. There we go. I'm okay now. In interaction quality, what the performance standard is looking for is whether the instructor is regularly interacting with all students in the class on an individual and a group basis. To be more specific, in a discussion, if you are interacting well with many of the individual students in the discussion, that will probably bring a good rating for you, a G, in interaction quality. If you are interacting both with individual students, with some posts addressed to individual students in response to their postings, and you also are making some posts which are addressed to the whole class, or posts which invite participation or comments from the whole class, that can move you into a B or best category. And one example of responding to a group of students might be if several students make their initial post right close to the end of the unit. You can make a post that's addressed, Bob, Sally, Joe, Mary, and then your post could say, thanks for your input. I appreciate what you said. It'll be more helpful for all of us in our future discussions if you make your initial post earlier. Or you can make group posts which simply address a point that several students have made. Maybe 3 or 4 students have essentially said the same thing or made a similar point. We know that happens in discussion, of course. You could make a post that's addressed to those 3 or 4 students and acknowledge what they mentioned and essentially talk to all of them rather than trying to make an individual post to each of them. Then, in addition, something that I try to always remember to do at my discussions is I will make some group posts that are addressed simply everyone. What did we learn about Jefferson and Adams in Chapter 3? A post that's addressed to everyone that is inviting their input. And Liz, I've kind of been jumping back and forth on you there for
oh no, that's okay.
Slide topics.
That's okay, and I accidentally hit the slide a couple of times, but I did want to, we have a question in Q&A from Eva. Is it okay to say something like this in public, i.e. where all the students can see it in the discussion? Please respond earlier next time or more substantially. And,
yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would say I see this in discussions, and while you wouldn't want to be as specific as to say, hey, you got a 72 on, you wouldn't want to post grade information, but I certainly have seen where Just for the benefit, you had great remarks, and so the class can benefit from those remarks and has time to thoughtfully respond. Could you please next time be sure to post earlier? I've seen that, and it's worded in a very polite way, and I personally don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's effective classroom management, and I'll see what John has to add too.
Yeah, I agree with that. I always try to be very general and polite in all responses to students in the discussion, saving the more specific grade-oriented type comments for the grading of their discussion work.
I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide, but then I also have a question from Janice in chat. Let's see here. Let me move to this next slide. I have a question, a pertinent question here from Janice in chat, and that is, I have been making more group postings for the late students in the discussions. Do you suggest we post that group message as a reply to the most recent student posting with 3 or 4 all students' names in the subject line, or should we post the group response as a new message, not as a reply to one of the students? I would say it would be effective the way that you've described it, Janice, that it would be effective either way. John mentioned he likes to do posts that say everyone, so that could be effective.
Yeah, either one of those would be fine. It's engaging the students, it's talking to them, and either one of those would clearly be a group type of response where your interaction is with more than just one student. On this next slide that Liz had moved to, one of the things I wanted to point out is the issue of class policies when interaction might be a challenge. Remember that many instructors have made it a policy that students should make their initial post by a specific day. And that can be a useful strategy to use. You know, 2 or 3 points might be deducted if the initial post is not made by a certain day. And the block of students issue that you see on this slide, I think we've kind of addressed that. If several students have not made any post at all until, let's say, the last day of the unit, you don't want to ignore all of them. Sure, they should have made their post earlier, but let's say you have a class of 20 students and fully like 8 or 10 of them don't make their first initial post until, let's say, the last day of the unit. There are 8 or 10 students that you don't want to completely ignore in the discussion. So you could make the kind of group message that we've been talking about that is addressed to all of those late posters. And you could make that post substantive. You could still talk about the topic-related issues that the students might have mentioned. But you'd want to post something if there's a good number of students who do not make any post at all until the last day. Don't sort of write them off, and you still can address them with the kind of group message we've talked about.
I'd like to address another question in the Q&A section at this point, and that is from Drew. What would be a good day to select for the first post day? And I'll just say from my experience, now my experience teaching online is English. I used to be full-time English faculty, and so I had students, you know, they were discussing their papers and writing and sometimes literature. So I don't know how that, you know, sometimes I know, well, I know that at CCC Online there are different policies depending on the course. What's the first post day and then what's the deadline. So some of that may be in the course design itself, but what had worked for me, I gave students the weekend really to think about it, and then the first post was due Monday at 5 p.m. Everything in the class was due at 5 p.m. First post due Monday at 5 p.m. and then their follow-up posts were due Wednesday at 5 p.m. And then that gave me some time, you know, I'd make my summary certainly by Friday, and that worked really well for my class, but I know that different, you know, you may have a set policy with this, but I'll let John address it too from his perspective. That's a really good question.
Yeah, it really can vary from course to course. If a unit is 2 weeks long, I might ask that the initial post be made at least no later than 1 week into the unit, so that still leaves another week for students to be responding to each other. And so it can vary, and that's something you also could chat with your department chair about to see if he or she has any preferences regarding a possible deadline for the first post.
And I think I was just thinking about this too, when you think about subject area. In my experience, and I've played around with this, I've found that when students are having a discussion that relates directly to a paper that they're currently drafting, it works best to have them strike while their thinking iron is hot, you know, and so you have a pretty small window for them to post and respond, because it just so happens that their paper is due in a few days. And then if there are some topics that perhaps are open for a couple of weeks and the students should spend a little bit more time thinking about it, and they have a little bit more, you know, the pacing is different, then I think it could be appropriate to give them a longer time. But I've found that sometimes making it a pretty short window is actually pretty effective, especially when it connects directly to another project that they're doing. But that's just a side note. And I'll go ahead and forward to the next slide here.
All right. And acknowledgement, another one of the important performance categories that we look at in the QA process. This is the category that pertains to your acknowledgement of the student's input, whether that acknowledgement is in the form of a compliment to the student, or if it's a correction. Maybe the student has made a post in which what they're saying is incorrect, or they've gotten a little off track. Acknowledgement can be either. It can be a pat on the back, it can be a correction, but the performance rubric that we have to use when reviewing discussion work asks if instructor posts regularly acknowledge students' understanding of content. So that's something you want to be sure to do. Don't only make posts which add to the discussion, maybe add new information, or posts which ask new questions. Be sure to also be acknowledging student input. And that brings me to an important thing I just want to mention before I turn the slide back over to Liz. Remember that we are not evaluating whether the students respond to you. We are only evaluating instructor performance in these categories and whether instructors are making the posts which satisfy these performance requirements. If you're making those posts, then the ball is in the student's court, and it's not your fault if students don't have robust responses to posts that you make. So we do not evaluate to what extent or whether students are responding to your posts.
Thank you, John. That's an excellent point, and indeed that question comes up frequently. Just sort of this worry that, boy, I have a class this semester that, you know, I'm trying everything I can do, and the students just are not re-engaging with me. And we're looking at whether you're re-engaging with the students who are posting and who are active. So that's a really great point. And I wanted to, before I move ahead, I just wanted to address a couple of the posts. And just on a recent topic, Brian mentioned for geography we use Wednesday and then 2 other participation posts by Sunday. So that's what one program is doing. And thank you for your continued participation there.
Yeah.
We have another question here from Janice that I'll go ahead and address. And that is, how does the QA team define regularly regarding instructor responses to students, would it be by percentage of students who posted? And that is a good question. We don't have a mathematical formula to that. If there are, I mean, if I look at a discussion that has 150 posts, and that I see sometimes, and there are 3 instructor posts, then I think just by looking at the numbers, you can see that that participation is not robust at all. You know, there is a certain, I mean, I guess there is a certain ratio there that the instructor needs to be in there frequently, you know, at least 3 days a week, 4 to 5 days a week for best, and that the instructor also needs to be timely. But I don't have a particular, I mean, I guess it's a bit of a squishy answer, but I don't have a particular number or formula that I look for there. I'll see if John has anything to add to that.
No, that's correct. There is no numerical standard or cutoff. If I'm reviewing, for example, 3 discussions, and we're talking about this category of acknowledgement, one of the ways I'll look for regular acknowledgement is if it's happening in all 3 of those discussions. And then after that comes the judgment, like Liz was alluding to, of not only is acknowledgement being made in all 3 discussions, but it's being made several times in each discussion. And again, there's no number cut off, but my approach, I'm always trying to give the instructor consideration. So we're not looking to generate N ratings. I'm just looking at it from the standpoint of, you know, the student experience in all 3 of these discussions. Not only did the instructor make some posts which acknowledge student input, whether the student is right or wrong, but they did it several times in each discussion. That is enough to say that it was regularly done.
I wanted to jump in there. Sorry, we had one more question too before we move on that Natalie asked.
Oh, Natalie has one. Okay, I saw one from Paulo, and I was going to address your question, Paulo, here. Just right. It pretty much is really in line with our next slide, so I will address it. Natalie. Sean, I don't see Natalie's question. Do you mind just reading that?
Sure, yeah, I think she sent that one just to me. So it was, is the summary posting the same as the discussion wrap-up that we're supposed to make at the end of each forum?
Oh, the summary posting, that, thanks for bringing that up. That varies by division. Some chairs want their instructors to make a closing summary post at the end of each discussion. Other chairs do not have that requirement. So when we do a review, that's not one of the real substantive review categories. We just say yes or no, that the instructor is making closing and summary comments or they're not. And some chairs don't care, others do. So we just say yes or no as to whether or not they're being used.
Right, and if you have any questions about that, if you're not sure about whether your chair would like to see that summary post, I would just go ahead and contact your chair directly. And we have a couple of good questions here in the Q&A box, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide because actually the questions are really pertinent to that. And we're still here on the acknowledgement category. And just talking about acknowledging students, and as John mentioned, it's not always about patting them on the back and saying good job, correct answer, because as we know, sometimes students, and you know, this is most obvious and pronounced when we're looking at math courses, sometimes students just get the wrong answer, in fact. And so one of the challenges there is how do you, and actually I'm going to go ahead and bring in Paulo's question here because it's pretty much exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes, and he said, sometimes I have a hard time to correct students in the unit. I usually do it when I grade each student. What would be a good tip to correct students in a group without making them feel weird and also in a way that will keep them participating in the discussions? And so I think that really ties in directly with the solutions here. So the challenge is students might be lost, they're on the wrong track. Sometimes students simply take the content matter and they make it personal. Oh, you know, this poem reminds me of my grandma. And then they say, oh yeah, my grandma, it reminds me of my grandma too. And they just start going on in a direction that you kind of want to rope them back into the text, right? So students can be lost. Maybe they just didn't follow the directions or only follow the directions partially. We see that quite a lot. And so you feel like, well, it's not appropriate for me to acknowledge their learning because they're sort of missing the boat. So some ways that you can address that, you can, first of all, just acknowledge whether they are on the right track. And it's amazing when I look at especially some of the Dev Ed courses, particularly some of the math courses, the pre-college level math courses, English and reading, and the way that those students, you know, they're posting and they're really trying. And I've taught Dev Ed English myself, and so again, kind of getting into every subject, of course, is a little bit different, and it's always an art form to try to read your students and figure out what's most appropriate in addressing them, especially online because you don't have the body language, right? So, but what I see in those Dev Ed courses, it's just, it always strikes me. I'm in admiration of those instructors because they really have a gift of acknowledging sometimes just whether the students are on the right track at all, and they take a little bit of what they said, and I really appreciate your participation. You had a great point in XYZ. However, please go back and read the directions. You definitely want to repost here answering this question. And so you can acknowledge, you know, partial recognition if you want and be positive. And again, it may depend on your particular class and the history of the students and what you're teaching. One thing that I've seen that I think is very effective, seems effective to me anyway, is, and the reason it seems effective to me is that you're encouraging the students to read more posts than just theirs and, you know, the professor's posts. You might refer the students to another student's post. So, Lucy, this is a great question, and John just asked the same question yesterday. Please see my response to him. Or perhaps, well, Lucy, why don't you take a look at John's post in which he explains this concept. You know, if one student isn't quite getting it but another is, don't be afraid to cross-reference the students to each other. And it's certainly not a bad thing, of course, to let students know when they're just not quite getting it and they're off base. And sometimes I see this comes a lot of times in the form of, please go back and review our lecture. I think perhaps you've missed a point here. Can anyone answer this question? Can anyone help them out? That kind of thing. We see that pretty frequently as well. So,
and
yeah.
One other item too, Paulo, that's a good question. And we've sort of touched on this before, but I just try to mix the sort of gentle, diplomatic comment with the correction. You know, thank you for your post, Susie. Appreciate your participation. And then I'll usually say something like, one quick clarification. These laws were not passed until after the Civil War. If I feel that the student has said something that is incorrect enough that it could actually confuse other students in the course who might read that and think that it's correct, then I'll try to do this sort of friendly, diplomatic comment along with something where I'll say one quick clarification and then mention what was incorrect.
And I've seen that too, along with what John's saying. I've certainly seen, let's say a student or a group of students, they're posting something that's just flat out incorrect, and you don't want the students to be confused. Sometimes just using that subject line and in the subject line saying, attention everyone, you know, please take a look at this. Just some of those strategies to kind of, you know, turn the conversation around and again, make sure that you're acknowledging when the ideas and when the facts or in the math equation they're getting something wrong. Sometimes just an attention-getting strategy too is to use that subject line. And we had a question also here from Drew, and it's a really big question, and I think in our entire presentation, I'm hoping we're addressing this, you know, just overall. But the question is, I go in every day, and so let's say you're posting every day, can I overdo it? And that's a great question. It's kind of a tough one to answer. I'll see if what John would have to say to that first.
I guess it's possible. I haven't really seen that yet in any of the QA reviews that I've done. Again, it would be possible, I guess, for an instructor to just overwhelm the discussion. But for the reviews that I've done thus far, really extensive instructor involvement has simply resulted in, you know, ratings of best for that instructor in the relevant categories. I have not seen it yet where it actually was clearly a detriment. Looking at it from the student perspective, a student participating in that discussion, I've only seen active instructor involvement to be beneficial.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the way that I look at that too, and when I look at courses, I always try to look at that from a student perspective. I'm thinking, and you know, we all know that some of our students in our classes are more ambitious perhaps than others, but I always think of those students who are really trying to squeeze every last drop of knowledge out of those courses, and they really are eager to learn. And so I think those courses in which instructors are really in there engaging and giving a lot of extra web links and information and acknowledgement, and that's really benefiting, at the least, you know, I think it benefits all the students, but the students have to click on the posts and read them to get the benefit, right? But I always look at it from the perspective of, okay, I'm the ambitious student who's trying to get as much out of these discussions as possible. And so to that end, like John said, I don't think I've seen any classes where I'd say, oh, this instructor is really overdoing the comments. The only possible pertinent thought I have to that is I have heard people say, well, I teach math or I teach science, and I really want the students to have time to go away and think about these problems, and so perhaps they're closer to the 48 hours than the 24 hours. You know, they want to hang back and let the students, you know, think about the problem amongst themselves. And so I've seen that maybe perhaps in the timeliness, but again, for best, it's you know, they're usually in there responding within 48 hours. So that's all in art form, and again, it does depend to some extent, even though we have the same rubric across the board. There's a little bit of variation between probably the subject matter, but I certainly don't think that the rubric favors any particular subject over another, because good teaching and good discussion facilitation is good discussion facilitation, I think, across the board. So I hope that was helpful. The questions are really good, by the way. Keep them coming. And I will go ahead and go on to the next slide. And I know I see something here from Janice, which I'll address here in just a moment. And this next category that we'd like to discuss, it's on the rubric, one of the rubric categories, is called additional posts. And it may be, as I mentioned at the beginning, just slightly misleading in that I think of additional posts as additional information, perhaps within the posts, as well as additional posts would imply you are posting something totally new to the discussion. So it's additional information within the post. So the wording of the category is that the instructor posts regularly add additional information and direct or redirect the discussion or appropriately close it. And so, you know, as I go through these and I think about all the discussions I've seen, it really, as you all know, it's really an art form to facilitate these discussions. And so it certainly isn't necessary that every single post you make gives the student a brand new website, but again, it's what's appropriate to the moment, you know. And so some of those additional posts may well be additional resources, as John mentioned a while back. You have, hey, everyone, a new book just came out on this subject, you might be interested. I saw a movie on this topic. You know, here's a website that might be of interest. So we see a lot of that, and that's certainly good. And sometimes the additional information is reminding the students of something you studied in the last unit, or perhaps even forecasting. Well, that's a good question, and we're going to get to that next month. So sometimes it can be just very simple things that you're doing that would satisfy the additional posts. So surefire ways to score a good and a best here. As appropriate, you would add information, and again, that can be in many forms. And as the little picture here indicates, you're just keeping reins of the discussion. You want the students to feel comfortable enough to join in and talk a lot, but you're the one really directing it the way that you want it to go. I'll go ahead and address at this point Janice's question.
Okay.
What percentage of graded but student-led discussions do you suggest? And I would say, you know, off the top of my head for that gets into course design. We do look for, we want to see 50% of the discussions, total discussions, are instructor-led. And by the way, for QA, this is a question we sometimes get too, we are not looking at the student-to-student discussion. So some classes, for example, writing classes, might have a workshop where the students are posting their papers and the other students are coming on and commenting, and that's not considered an instructor-led discussion. Other student-to-student discussions might be extra credit or Q&A. So we're looking at the instructor-led discussions. And if that doesn't answer your question or you have follow-ups, just please let us know. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next here. Okay, and this is also on additional posts. And it's just the idea of overwhelming students here. If you have, for example, let's say you have a discussion that's just started and it has maybe 20 posts, and 15 of those posts are yours. That may be, and I honestly, I really don't see that much, but there is a common concern that instructors have, and some of you brought it up today, that I really want to be careful about not overwhelming the students. And having taught online myself, I can say this is really a challenge, because in a classroom you can look out and see, you know, you can take a reading, kind of the emotional reading of the class, and see where the students are, and are they with you, and are they glazing over, and are they looking confused or not, and this really is hard to tell with an online environment. So again, it's something you just get a feel for, and again, it's an art form, but solutions to this idea are that, again, you do not need to add new information in every post. And again, some of it is going to depend on the class you're teaching and the subject. And I just think of those Dev Ed English courses that I've taught. It would have been a poor choice for me to add lots and lots of information in a class where the students' reading comprehension levels are rather weak, and that's why they're in the class, to work on that, to work on reading and writing. So I would need to kind of know my audience there. There are other courses, say in philosophy, where the students are eager and they're with you and they're hungry for more, and then you want to give them more reference. Hey, why don't you look at this philosopher in this century and what this person said? So, to some extent, it really depends on your students and what you're doing. So it's only as appropriate that you would need to add information. But from a QA perspective, we do look for that, and there needs to be in the posts, if we look at the posts collectively as a group, and there is information added throughout the discussion as appropriate. And again, I already addressed this, I think, but common ways to meet this requirement for additional posts. Add a web link, additional bit of information, and there's certainly nothing wrong, and in my experience, students need repetition. They need to be reminded, oh, in the last unit, we talked about comma splices and run-on sentences, and we talked about how to avoid those, and perhaps I'm seeing a few of those here, and so, here's a little reminder of that. Okay, I'll go ahead and move right along. Okay, so this is the final category we'll be discussing today. So thanks, by the way, for staying with us It's almost 2, so just being mindful here of the time. The last category here that we're looking at today is engagement and re-engagement. And the wording on the rubric that we're following is that the instructor posts regularly re-engage individual learners as well as the entire class through the use of additional questions at the same or higher level. So we're basically looking to see if there are some questions being asked back to the students. And this is similar to what you would see in a well-run face-to-face classroom, that the professor is constantly asking, prodding the students for more, and what does everybody else think, and could you clarify that point? And so that's what we're looking for here, just the type of re-engagement that you're going to see in any good classroom anywhere. So the surefire ways to score good and best there is ask questions about what the students post. Now, frequently I see posts that, it's something that I notice because of what I've taught, but I sometimes notice that students' writing isn't always the greatest, and so sometimes I read what the students wrote, and I'm not quite sure what they're trying to say. And quite frequently I see the professors asking that, I'm not really sure that I got your point. Would you mind, clarifying this for us? And so, keeping in mind that the discussions are text-based and some students' writing skills may need a little work too. So just asking questions, could you reword that? Could you reread that and make sure it's what you wanted to say? So sometimes it's just clarifying what they're trying to ask or what they're trying to say. Or if it's clear, if the point is clear, you may just ask questions about the content, the subject. And again, every single post certainly does not need to be asking questions, but the questions are, we look for questions, sometimes when appropriate, throughout the discussion. Okay, so a common challenge with engagement and re-engagement is that students are just not, again, it's something that we hear a lot, is that students are not participating very well, or they're not at the level that I'd like them to be in terms of their posts. They're just kind of going through the motions here. They're not really getting into it. They're not getting to where I'd like them to be. They're not posting much of substance. So how would I respond to that? And again, as I just mentioned, you could simply ask for a clarification, and it's always okay, and a lot of times it's appropriate, to go ahead and go back to the basics. Sometimes I've experienced this myself personally. I walk into a classroom and I imagine that my students have all done the reading, and perhaps that's not really the case. And so sometimes it's just reminding them to reread certain things, or can you offer us a couple of quotes from the text that would support your point? Or where in the story did you see that happen? Or where, whatever the case may be. So you can always direct them back toward the text or the e-text. And you might ask them to summarize what they've learned in the past as a springboard. And sometimes I've seen discussions in which students are assigned. You have some leader students who are assigned to summarize the discussions. And myself, I've used weekly leaders where there's certain students assigned for every discussion to come up with questions for the class, and then they are supposed to follow up. And so I've seen that sometimes. That can be effective, but that's just, again, that's just a side note. But I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions, particularly about engagement, and see if John might have anything to add as well.
Yeah, what I would throw in there is that sometimes what I'll do in a discussion to be sure I'm performing well in the engagement and re-engagement category is I'll choose a couple of student posts where the student has really given kind of a flat, basic, very simple answer to the discussion question. And in order to, like the title says, re-engage that student, ask them a question like, thanks for that post, Susie. What would be 2 or 3 modern-day examples of that you could point to? Or I've seen an instructor make a post like, thanks for your comment, Bob. How could you use this formula or this theory or this idea in common everyday life? Questions that bring the student back in. They've given a very flat, basic answer. and you are re-engaging them by saying, give me an example. How could we use this in daily life, etc.?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's always helpful, and it tends to get students talking when you ask them something perhaps initially that is pretty much within their comfort zone. So for an example of that with me, I have asked students, well, what did you learn in your high school classes about writing paragraphs? You know, what rules do you remember being taught? And then the understanding is, let's discuss that, and I'm not going to jump in and say, oh, well, that's so silly, that's wrong. You know, it's just kind of taking down that fear. It's like, yeah, let's talk about what we've learned in the past, and let's talk about those rules and whether they're always valid in every rhetorical situation and so on. So there are certainly things that you can do, and sometimes it's just as basic as, okay, out of these 5 poems, which one did you like the best and why? And of course, that's very, very basic, you know, pre-college, but sometimes if they're intimidated by the material, which students often are intimidated by poetry, for instance, it's just asking them a quite easy, just what's their emotional reaction to begin with. And then the challenge, of course, is that you move beyond that and that you shape the discussion from that point. But sometimes I think the students, I was in a recent conference with a presentation where one of the presenters said something that really struck me, and that is that in an online environment, students do not want to appear stupid. They don't want to look bad in front of their peers. They're embarrassed, they're self-conscious, and so just keeping in mind that sometimes students, they don't want to be the first one to volunteer. They're shy or they're reticent for whatever reason, and it could be because of the material. You know, just trying to get something from them, and even if you're starting with something that you think maybe is a little too basic, sometimes it might get the ball rolling and eventually in the direction you want it to go.
And since the engagement category does ask for engagement and re-engagement of individual students and the whole group, you can make some of these posts that we've been talking about that are addressed to individual students. But you also can make a couple of posts in every discussion which are specifically addressed to the whole group and which ask a question. Maybe something like, what was the most surprising fact about Thomas Jefferson we learned in this unit? And address it everyone. And you are now re-engaging the whole group. So you're helping yourself meet that performance expectation of re-engaging not only individual students with re-engaging questions to individual posts, but some questions that are addressed to the whole group.
Also an excellent point, and thank you everyone for your participation throughout this. You've had some really excellent questions, and actually the next slide here is simply we are here at the end of our presentation, at least of the information that we've outlined for you. So we'd like to see if you all have any general questions.
Certainly several good ones already during the course of the presentation, like Liz mentioned, so I want to add my thanks for that. Also remember too, everyone, that in the instructor handbook, in the section that deals with the QA performance review expectations, there are even examples. And you can take a look at those as examples of a post that re-engages, a post that adds information, etc. And you always can feel free to ask us too. Send either of us an email for some further clarification about any QA category.
We have a recent webinar that is living on the website and archived, and it's called Keeping Discussions Rolling. And in that webinar, John and I talked about basically tips for those classes or those occasions in which the discussions just seem stuck and you want to breathe life in them, and what are some little tricks, you know, just kind of a bag of tricks there for those situations, and some skills and tips there. And so that's out on our website and on the webinar archive rather. So if you're interested, that might be something you'd want to check out as well. And we had some really great questions and participation with that also.
And Ken, that would be a source for some good examples in the various QA categories.
Yeah, if you go to the instructor handbook, there are a number of links there that deal with the discussion, the QA threaded discussion rubric, and there's an FAQ, and then alongside that, as John mentioned, there are just some really quick examples. And it's always artificial, I think, to pull out just one little exchange from a student to an instructor, because what we really do is, you know, we really look at least 2 full discussions in each course. And so we look at what's going on throughout that discussion. We're not, of course, just looking at one response, but at least on the website, that is meant to give you an idea of how to meet those various categories. And you are very welcome to everyone who's sending us kind notes.
Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and take our leave. And thank you very much for your time and your participation. We really do appreciate it. And this will be archived on our webinar as well.
Yes, thank you guys both very much. That was really helpful. And we will have this up on the archive probably by, I would say, Monday or Tuesday of next week. You should see it up there if you want to go back and review anything. And yeah, thanks for bearing with me when I was a little bit tardy today, and thanks for everybody for attending. And I'm sure, I'm just going to volunteer you guys for this, but I'm sure that Liz and John would be happy to answer any questions that you think of later, just over email as well.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah, feel free to ask us those follow-ups if you have them, if you think of them later.
Great. Well, thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Liz and John, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.